Molweni kwakhona. Oh. Nami kaloku ndimfutshane. Hayi ke oh, okay. I move also. Do I point that side or this side? He said this side. I must look at you. Okay. That is my topic. I'm talking about the meso-level analysis of translation and interpreting services in language policy implementation. It's not moving. Oh. That's the outline. I'm just not going to waste time, but I'll deal with the introduction. Problem with top-down policy models, defining the meso-level, agency theory, and forms of institutional response, and comparative studies. Oh, I've forgotten that I have this one here. As a way of introduction, I look at this as a puzzle that we, together as ALASA, need to be solving, or as Zim and RSA and other countries. Why do similar language policies produce different outcomes? And I'm looking at the RSA, that's the Republic of South Africa's constitution that is recognizing 12 official languages, and as approved in the 1996, and also it was then amended in 2023 when the South African Sign Language was then added. And then it establishes the principle of equality and access, and yet the reality varies dramatically. Institutions provide comprehensive translation and interpreting services. Others offers multilingual or no provision at all. Others offer minimal or no provision, but many fall somewhere in between. The puzzle is, that is where that has have those colored the puzzle. The answer, I argue, lies at the meso-level. And my central claim for this presentation is that there is limited or no provision of translation and interpreting services, that is T&I services, and therefore the success or failure of language policy implementation is determined not primarily by content of macro-level policy text, but by the decisions, practices, and agency of meso-level institutional actors. And then the meso-level institutions are not passive conduits. As we are here, we're in an academic institution, we are at meso-level. They are active agents. They are active agents whose practices ultimately determine whether institutional promises of multilingualism translate into lived experiences. Now, I'm quoting here Wang. I like what Wang, the problem with the top-down approach when I'm wearing the academic hat, that is the top-down approach. When we start at macro level and then we go at meso-level, hence it is red because that is my focus. And then I'm going, and then also then at macro level, that is the individuals. And then here the traditional view of policy implementation and the assumption that I'm making here, that the policy is clear and unambiguous, implementation is technical and neutral, and outcomes should be uniform. And then on the other side, when I'm looking at it, problems with this view is that policies are often ambiguous and contradictory. Institutions have their own cultures, constraints, priorities, frontline discretion is inevitable. Implementation gaps are the norm, not the exception. And then the problem then that I'm saying, this linear model cannot explain the variation for the translation, or for the provision of translation of service, the provision of translation and interpreting services. And I like what Wang, that's the theory that I'm using for this, is that with this macro, meso, and micro level, And then by this, just quickly, at national level, the actors are the government, the legislatures, they establish in the function that they do, they establish principles, policies, rights, frameworks. At meso-level, that is where my focus is, institutional and organizational. The actors, hospitals, universities, colleges, whatsoever, governments and departments, and then interpret, adapt, and operationalize. Then lastly, at micro level, the individual is interactional, and then the actors are practitioners, the citizens, and enact the policy daily. So now, in this regard, then the meso-level is the critical mediating space. It is where abstract principles become operational, procedures, legislative mandates meet resource constraints, policy texts encounter institutional cultures, decisions about translation and services provision are actually made. That is where things are happening. Now let's look at what then happens at meso-level. As I say, that is the focus of this one. And when I'm looking at meso-level, that is the decisions in shaping the provision of translation and interpreting services. It is that we're looking at procurement. I'm not going to be looking at all of these things. The procurement, we know what procurement is. We're looking at the qualifications. We know in terms of our qualifications, and especially in this one, we know that most of our the African countries, our provision, or the translators rather, and interpreters, it's not a regulated industry. And in South Africa, it is still the case. We're trying to regularize it, but unfortunately, we are not there yet. We are getting there. And the issue of quality, and I'm not going to labor on that one. And then there's the issue of technology, the artificial intelligence, and so on. And then the access protocols, and then in terms of then the citizens. And then the budget allocations, how many times when you say we want translation provision, like here, so people wanted the provision of translation and interpreting services, and some of them were teasing me and said, Pencil, why don't you provide the interpreting services for this conference? And I said, I'm not here as Pencil for now, I'm here as an academic. So ask me that question later. But the most important things that these are not technical decisions, they are political normative choices that shape who gets access to linguistic rights. And the agency framework that, as I've indicated, that I'm focusing at meso-level, and I'm talking about UWENG, and the first one is conformity. That is aligning institutional policy closely with macro level policy, implementing mandates as intended. And here the example that I'm citing here, it is the hospital that systematically implements the RSA official languages requirements that could be replicated in any part of the world, whether it's here in Africa or elsewhere in the world. And then secondly, I'm looking at the resistance. People are still resisting there. The active or passive subversion of policy mandates and symbolic compliance without substantive implementation. And the example that I'm citing there, it is a university that produces multilingual policies but provides no actual translation and interpreting services. That is still the case. And then the third one is the configuration. In terms of the configuration, adopting and interpreting policy to fit local context, creative responses to reduce constraints. And the example that I'm citing there, it is the government that's developing community interpreter networks where professional availability or is not, there is no availability there. And beyond the three categories, its agency is not simply a choice between these categories, and the factors that are shaping these institutional agency, I argue, its resource constraints, professional norms, institutional culture, leadership, accountability mechanism, citizen demand. And the comparative studies that I want to make are these. It's that at macro level, I'm looking at the constitution of the country, the Pencil Act, and UOLA. That is the use of official languages. I'm just going to then, and then at meso level, that is the national government departments. And at macro level, that is the conformity plus active reconfiguration within resource constraints, resistance through neglect. So on this slide, I will then, these are the three universities, that is the comparative, the historical Africans University, and the historical English universities, and the historical Black universities. And then the way they behave, all these universities is different. But then the first one in particular, the paradox, I'm not going to read a lot of that. It's the paradox that constitutionally multilingualism exists, but English dominance persists because meso-level actors do not implement the translation and interpreting services. Whereas when you look at these two, the resistance through minimal compliance, and then on the last one, and I use Black, and I highlighted that with Black because that includes, when we categorize those in South Africa, we categorize the Africans, the Indians, and the colors. So, but I'm not going to then deal with that. And these are the factors, these are the institutional history, the leadership, the resources, accountability, citizen pressure, and the policy of the parity. And then the theoretical, that I've dealt with the theoretical implications. At meso level, it's not neutral. I'm not going to read that. And the agency is distributed and relational. And resistance takes many forms. And lastly, policy is never fully determined at macro level. And the practical implications, I have the three role players there, and I'm not going to deliberate on that. We have the policymakers, the institutional leaders that advocate, leaders, as well as the advocates and communities, because in this conference we have all these role players. And then these are the functions that these people should be playing. Design at meso level and make the agency, and then recognize your agency on the other side, and then build institutional infrastructure, and then lastly there at communities target the meso level. And in conclusion, I'm not sure how much time I do have, but I won't read everything there. At that macro level language policies are necessary but insufficient. They establish principles that rights, but they do not determine outcomes. And then at meso level, that is where my focus is. Meso level institutions are the critical site of language policy implementation. That is who we are. We are here now. Their decisions and practices and agencies shape whether constitutional promises become a lived reality. Thirdly, that translation services provision is shaped by institutional choices about procurement, as I indicated earlier on, and I listed. I'm not going to go through the list. And then lastly, that the sustainability and that the sustainable language policy implementation. But then lastly, the question is, what does the language policy say? It's easy for us to say that our university or your country is multilingual. Rather, the question that we should be asking ourselves, what do institutions do to make that language policy a reality? That is the crux of it, and that lies at meso level. Ngalawo mazwi tatenda. Enkosi, thank you. Did I make it?